Within 30 years after Columbus had discovered America in 1492, Spanish navigators had explored the east coast of the new continent. Realizing that it was not India as Columbus had thought, they sailed around its southern tip and found the sea route to the Orient. On the way back, they stopped at Mexican ports. Other Spaniards had already conquered Peru and Mexico, where they found immense wealth to plunder and ship home to Spain. There, a book had been published titled The Deeds of Esplandian. It caused great excitement and soon appeared in other languages. Know ye, it said, that at the right hand of the Indies there is an island named California, an island of steep and craggy rocks. It is inhabited by women carrying weapons made of gold. They are ruled by a beautiful queen, Calafia. The island abounds with gold, pearls, and precious stones, and no other metal is found there. Gold, pearls, precious stones. On the 28th of September, 1542, 3 stormy months after they had departed from New Spain, as Mexico was then called, 2 tiny Spanish vessels found shelter in a port behind this tongue of land. Their commander was Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, a Portuguese in the service of Spain. His orders were to explore the unknown regions, learn something about the inhabitants, find out where all the treasures were, and claim the land for Spain. Cabrillo named the port San Miguel. It became San Diego. The ship's log tells that the expedition remained in port 6 days to replenish wood and water. Then they continued the voyage, exploring the coast for several months and observing many small Indian settlements, but finding no treasures. They ran into fog and heavy storms. Cabrillo suffered a badly broken arm and died of fever. He was buried on San Miguel Island. The others returned to Mexico. For a time, Spain lost interest in California, but other nations did not. They hoped to find the Straits of Anian, a legendary waterway said to link the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans somewhere up north. Such a waterway would open a shorter trade route to the Orient, and they wanted a share of that profitable trade. They envied the Spaniards for the rich loot they removed from the South American possessions. Because Spain would permit no outsiders there, Dutch and English privateers caught and plundered the treasure-filled Spanish galleons instead. One of the most famous of these privateers, or pirates, was Francis Drake. In 1579, he sailed his storm-damaged ship, the Golden Hind, into this bay just north of today's San Francisco and beached it for repairs. The ship was crammed with loot taken from Spanish galleons. Accounts from members of Drake's party say that they built a fort-like enclosure on the beach and were visited by friendly natives who gave gifts to their leader. Drake named the country New Albion, since the white cliffs reminded him of his England. He took possession of the land in the name of Queen Elizabeth. After a stay of 1 month, the Golden Hind departed. Prior to sailing, so the account reads, a plate of brass and a 6-pence piece had been nailed to a post as claim of England's ownership of the land. Drake sailed due west to elude the Spaniards, going home by way of Asia and the Cape of Good Hope, arriving in England after 3 years at sea, the second man ever to make the trip around the world in a ship. Soon Drake was famous. Accounts of his adventures were published in many countries. Artists painted pictures showing his reception in New Albion. They showed the Indian huts and the natives themselves congregating and rejoicing as Drake received a crown for a faraway queen. For his exploits and the treasures that he had brought her, the Queen made Francis Drake a knight. Now Spanish ships sailed north again from Mexico. They wanted no rival in the land they claimed was theirs, but they found only primitive Indians, some of them fishing from simple rafts. The English had not returned. There were no treasures anywhere, so the Spanish left again. For 160 years, no permanent settlement was established in California. When it came about in 1769, it was not due to the search for gold, but to a fur-bearing animal. The kelp beds off the California coast were breeding grounds for great herds of sea otter. Their pelts brought high prices in China. Russian trappers had all but exterminated them in Alaskan waters. Now they began to hunt them farther south. Spain became worried again. 2 expeditions were sent north with orders to watch the Russians and keep them out of California. To this end, they were to build a fortified post at San Diego and another at Monterey. Captain Gaspar de Portola led the land expedition toward the port of Monterey, described by an earlier explorer. Because of the mountains, he failed to recognize Monterey. In his report to the Viceroy, Portola wrote that they moved on, and a few days later came upon a hill and saw before them a great inlet of water. Unknowingly, they had discovered San Francisco Bay. But Portola, a good soldier, was not impressed. His orders were to find Monterey. "We went back to San Diego," he wrote, "because we missed Monterey. We were out of supplies and arrived half-starved. We will try again." They did several months later, and this time they succeeded. On June 3rd, 1770, with the supply ship San Antonio standing by offshore and Indians watching, a solemn service was held and the country formally claimed for Spain. Soon the bells would ring from adobe missions all along the coast, from Monterey to San Diego. Now that it had been learned that California was not an island, it was decided to bring in settlers and livestock overland from Mexico. Captain Juan Bautista de Anza, a former Indian fighter, was chosen to find a trail from Sonora to Monterey and San Francisco Bay, and then lead a group of immigrants there. This was the kind of country de Anza and his small band of soldiers had to cross in 1774 when they entered California from Mexico. A seemingly endless desert stretched before them. More than once they got bogged down in deep sand drifts and had to decide whether to continue or go back. The fine sand sifted into everything: their eyes, their clothes, their food supplies. Running out of water, they had to walk on foot to save the strength of their horses. But they plodded on, desperately searching for water holes. Having passed the sand dunes did not mean the end of their troubles. They still had to cross much arid desert, barren rocky hills, sandy stretches with brush and cactus the only growth. Then they had to find passes through the steep mountains to the north. Once they had crossed them, the worst was over. There was enough water and pasture for the animals, and no great difficulty in finding the trail up north. Arrived at Monterey, de Anza knew his main job was still ahead: to return to Mexico, find qualified settlers with families, round up livestock and supplies, and guide all safely to their destination. This is the original diary of the journey, written by Padre Pedro Font. September 29th, 1775. Most of the people and animals for the expedition have been assembled. Mass was sung, and we began our march at 4:30 in the afternoon from the Presidio San Miguel to Orcasitas. They skirted the sand dunes as best they could, but could not avoid the Borrego Badlands. A plaque off the desert highway to San Diego marks the place where they passed through. The day broke very cold. The commander decided to remain here until all the members of the expedition who were behind would gather. They went on again, marching through desert where even today the highway ends. We set out from the bottom of the valley at 9 in the morning. We traveled 5 leagues and arrived at a pass with little grass and less water. A child was born to the wife of a soldier. Heavy rains held them up after they had crossed the mountains in January. News of a bloody Indian uprising at San Diego delayed them at San Gabriel 6 weeks, while De Anza and his soldiers hurried south to fight the Indians. It was late February when they set out again from San Gabriel Mission. Now they moved at a steady pace, with De Anza, 2 of his officers, and Padre Font in the lead. The sick were carried on litters strapped to mules. They arrived at Monterey in mid-March. Leaving the settlers there, De Anza hurried on north. A month after he had left San Gabriel, he arrived at San Francisco Bay. He chose a site for the Presidio. The royal Spanish flag was raised. De Anza's mission was completed. He and Padre Font returned to Mexico. There, the diary was copied by a scribe to go with the report to the Viceroy. The final entry was dated June 23rd, 1776. On June 23rd, 1776, the Spanish occupation and settlement of California had become official. 2 weeks later, on July 4th, a new nation, yet unnamed, came into being on the other side of the continent. Spain was unconcerned. Soon Indian fishermen saw more Spanish ships sailing into the bay. Indian hunters were frightened by the boom of Spanish guns. Indians were pressed into labor gangs by Spanish soldiers. At the same time, the mission fathers tried to convert them to Christianity. From books with especially colored notes, they were to learn religious songs. But most of them clung to their ancient chants and dances and to their custom of gambling even at mission festivities. And they remained reluctant to wear clothes. Indian labor helped the missions pay their own way. Indians learned to make candles from tallow, press olives, and tan cattle hides. The hides were sold to Yankee captains who sometimes showed up at the nearby shores. The neophytes, as the converts were called, lived near the missions they had helped to build. Their labors helped to make the missions prosper. But their Spanish masters remembered the San Diego massacre and other uprisings. There were soldiers' quarters at every mission. The ringing bell and the booming gun were never far apart. All mission activities were carefully recorded. Father Maynard Geiger, historian of Franciscan missions at Santa Barbara, shows with what great care annual crop and livestock figures were kept, and all births and deaths were registered. But gradually the role of the missions changed. To attract more settlers, the government began to offer large land grants called ranchos to former soldiers and other deserving people. The missions became their social center. Free land and cheap labor soon made the rancheros wealthy. They raised great herds of cattle. At roundup time, they were appraised for quality by sharp-eyed traders. They took great pride in their horsemanship, and one of their favorite sports was the hunting of the grizzly bear, now extinct in California. They loved parties. Hospitable to outsiders, they did not worry, as did their government, about who might hunt the sea otter. But then the Russians decided to set up a permanent trading outpost in California. In 1812, the Russian-American Company built a fort on the coast above San Francisco. Fort Ross, which means Russian fort, was surrounded by a strong stockade with blockhouses containing small cannon. A chapel served the 100 Russians and their 80 Aleut Indian hunters who lived outside the enclosure. The commander's house was within. From the day their flag was first raised, the Russians tried to win friends among the Spanish, since they wanted to trade with them. They gave bells cast with Cyrillian letters to some of the missions. At the same time, the hunters killed thousands of sea otter that lived off the coast. The furs were sold to Boston skippers who often helped the hunters. Here are some relics found at Fort Ross. Aleut spearheads and tools carved from whalebone, fish hooks, talismans, and Tsarist coins the Russians used in the area. Today, the name of the town of Sebastopol and the Russian river, once called Slavianka, are reminders that the Russians had a colony in California. Spain could do nothing about it. In 1822, she herself lost Mexico to a national uprising. Agustin Iturbide, a former Spanish officer, became emperor. A year later, he was overthrown and Mexico was proclaimed a republic. The Mexican flag brought many changes to California. To stem discontent within, the missions had to give up their land, half to the Indians, half to the public. To ward off dangers from without, General Vallejo was put in command of a strong garrison at Sonoma near Fort Ross. Vallejo did not believe the Russians were a threat to Spain. He was friendly toward the American fur trappers who appeared in increasing numbers in California. But Governor Alvarado and his successor, Micheltorena, wanted them kept out. To this end, they made large land grants rather freely to natives and naturalized citizens, often to make political friends. Today, the land grant documents are kept in the state archives at Sacramento. When California became a part of the United States, they were all re-examined by a land commission. Every landowner had to submit a hand-drawn map with his title papers to have his claim honored. They've already scaled the Sierra Nevada. We're threatened by hordes of Yankee emigrants we cannot stop. They will succeed in anything they start. Thus wrote a worried Mexican official about the early American overland parties. In 1839, John Augustus Sutter, a Swiss soldier of fortune, became a naturalized Mexican and made friends with Alvarado. The governor thought he would make a useful ally and gave him a large land grant by the Sacramento River. There, Sutter built a strong fort as center of his own little empire he called New Helvetia. By 1841, the Russians had all but killed off the sea otter. Their efforts at farming had failed, and they abandoned Fort Ross. Sutter bought the livestock and everything else that could be moved. Now the final chapter opens in the early history of California. This is an eyewitness account in words and pictures by William Myers, a gunner on the sloop Cyane, a ship in the Pacific Squadron of the young United States fleet. On this map, Gunner Myers charted the zigzag course the squadron followed to elude pursuing British ships. There are accounts of landings in South American and Mexican ports and pictures of the people, the water carrier, the bread man, the local blacksmith at work. This is San Diego as it appeared from the sea 300 years after Cabrillo had landed. There were shore leaves with receptions and gay parties and dancing into the early hours. But the American squadron commander, Commodore Sloat, had been given secret orders. Suddenly, the parties were at an end. The Americans sailed away, due west at first to fool the English fleet. About that time, American settlers had started a revolt at Sonoma. Using red cloth from a petticoat, they fashioned a flag with a star and a bear on it. With support from Captain John Fremont, they took General Vallejo as prisoner to Sutter's fort. On the high seas, the American sailors learned that they had orders to occupy the California ports. Ship discipline was tightened with corporal punishment for offenders. Early in July 1846, the ships approached the coast. The tension mounted, and so did the number of sick calls, according to Gunner Myers. On July 7th, the squadron dropped anchor in Monterey Bay. The decisive moment had come. Gunner Myers painted a dramatic picture of the storming of Monterey. Actually, the landing party under Captain Mervine met with no resistance. There simply were no soldiers to resist. The only shots fired at Monterey were the gun salutes by the ships, as Commodore Sloat gave the order to raise the stars and stripes over the customs house. The old customs house is now a historical museum. The bay itself is the home port of the small fishing fleet. Overlooking the bay is Fort Mervine, an army post. For the captors of Monterey, shore duty began. There was time off to go inland and watch the Indians gambling and to hunt for deer and boar. Though vigilance was maintained, nothing disturbed the quiet. All remained peaceful at Monterey. On August 15th, just 5 weeks after the takeover, the first California newspaper appeared in print, partly in English and partly in Spanish. The first issue brought news of the fleet, discussed prospects of California, and came out for a constitutional assembly. But the most important item was the proclamation of war between the United States and Mexico, which President Polk had issued 3 months earlier. Indeed, though Monterey was peaceful, some battles were fought elsewhere, such as at San Pasqual near Oceanside, where outnumbered U.S. cavalry was badly beaten, and at Buena Vista, where American forces gained a major victory before the 28th Star Flag flew over all of California. "300 years of history. There's a statue of Cabrillo at Point Loma, where he landed in 1542. A plaque tells of the feat of the Portuguese discoverer. The plate of brass that Francis Drake left nailed to a post was found in 1934. It is kept in the Bancroft Library of the University of California. A statue of Father Serra marks the original site of San Diego Mission. Now there are cities along the route the early Spanish settlers opened with their ox carts. The dusty trail they called King's Highway today is worthy of the name. Some of the missions and pueblos have been restored by the state. Purísima Concepcion, San Juan Bautista, Carmel. There are the baking ovens, olive presses, grinding stones, and tallow vats where Indians labored. An Indian burial ground at Pala, the only mission still serving a pueblo. Others are in ruins. There's Sonoma, where the California flag was born. The battlefield of San Pascual. The chapel at Fort Ross. A gun at Monterey. This is Monterey's Colton Hall. Through these doors, on the first day of September, 1849, entered 48 men, chosen senators, ready to sign a document they had labored over for some weeks. The California Constitution. Among its signers, the original is kept in the state archives, were General Vallejo and John Sutter. Both had switched their allegiance in good time. Within a year, California would become the 31st state of the Union. Now that the Constitution was signed, Sutter hurried back to his fort. His landing place was crowded with ships. Almost overnight, he had become world famous because of a find his carpenter had made while building a sawmill. But that's another story.